The rain came down the way the rain comes down only in late October, when the year has decided in earnest that summer will not be coming back, and that the proper business of the world is mud and cold hands, and the slow patient drowning of every road between every village in the Cotswolds. I rode home that afternoon on Patience my mare, because Patience was the only horse left to me, and because the apothecary in Stowe had not been willing to send a boy with the laudanum and the willow bark and the small brown packet of nerve drops that my father required if he was to sleep at all that night. He had charged me a shilling more than the price written on the door, and he had set it with his eyes on the worn place at the cuff of my riding habit. And I had paid him without comment because comment was a luxury I had not been able to afford for some considerable time. My name is Yseult Marchand. I was 24 years old in the autumn of 1817, and I was the only daughter of Lord Bramwell Marchand, ninth Baron of an estate that had not been able to pay its own taxes for 3 quarters running, and I had been running that estate by myself for a year and 1 month, since the morning I had come down to breakfast, and found my father slumped sideways in his chair with the right half of his face hanging loose like a curtain that had come off its rings. He had not died. He had not, as Dr. Ashworth had warned us to expect, died within the first 3 days, or the first 3 weeks, or the first 3 months. He had simply settled into the long, quiet country of those who cannot speak, and I had settled into the work of speaking for him, and so the days had gone. The rain fell harder as I came down the long slope past Farringdon Corner, where the hedgerow gives way to a low stone wall, and the wall gives way to a ditch deep enough to lose a sheep in. The light was already beginning to fail, though it could not have been past 4. I had pulled the hood of my cloak so far forward that I could see only the wet road directly under Patience's hooves, and so I almost did not see the horse standing at the edge of the ditch. He was a tall black stallion with the reins steaming off his flanks, and he stood very still, and his reins hung down into the ditch as though he were holding something there. I drew Patience up. I sat for a moment. I am not, by nature, a woman who rushes towards strange horses on empty roads in heavy rain. But the stallion turned his head toward me, and he did not flick his ears back, and there was something in the angle of his neck that I have since thought of as a kind of waiting. I dismounted. The mud took my boot to the ankle. I led Patience to the wall and looped her rein over the iron ring that was set there for the use of farmhands cutting the verge, and I went forward on foot to where the black stallion stood. He let me come. He did not even shift his weight. I looked down into the ditch, and I saw the man. He was lying half on his side and half on his back, with one arm flung up and the other folded under him, and the water in the ditch was running around his shoulders and over his thighs and out again at his boots, and the water was pink, not red. The rain had been at it long enough that the red had been washed thin into pink, and the pink ran away down the ditch in a long, thin ribbon and disappeared under the culvert at the corner. He was wearing a black greatcoat. The greatcoat was very fine, even soaked, even smeared with mud, even with the long, ragged tear in the side where the wet had blackened it further. I could see that the cloth was the kind of cloth I had only ever touched once, at a wedding in Bath when I was 16. It was the kind of cloth one does not buy. It is given. I did not ask his name. I have wondered since, many times, whether I would have done anything differently if I had known. I do not think I would. I knelt at the edge of the ditch and put my hand against his throat, under the wet collar, and I felt the pulse there moving slowly and steadily as a man rowing a boat across a long lake at night. He was alive. He was deeply unconscious. The blood at his side was not gushing. It was seeping, which Dr. Ashworth had once told me was either the best sign or the worst, depending on whether the wound had clotted or whether the man inside the wound had simply run dry. I did not let myself consider the second possibility. I climbed down into the ditch. He was heavier than any man I had ever lifted. I am not a small woman, My mother had been tall, and I had inherited her shoulders, and I had spent the last year doing the work of 2 grown men about the home farm. But he was a tall man and a broad man, and the wet greatcoat alone must have weighed 3 stone. I got his arm over my shoulder. I got my own arm under his. I dragged him up the side of the ditch in a series of 3 short, stumbling efforts, with the mud sliding away under my heels and the rain in my eyes. And at the 3rd effort, I got him up onto the verge, and I sat down in the wet grass with his head on my lap, and my breath going in and out of me like a bellows that had sprung a leak. He did not stir. The black stallion came over and put his nose against the man's hair, very gently, the way a horse will do when he is checking on something he loves. And at that small private gesture I understood for the first time that this was not an ordinary fallen man, and that the horse had been standing guard. I do not remember clearly how I got him onto Patience. I remember that I led the mare into the ditch. She went, bless her old bones, without protest, and that I stood her sideways against the lip of the verge so that the man's body had only to be rolled and slid rather than lifted, and that the black stallion stood at her head all the while like a soldier holding a friend's coat. I remember that I tied the man's wrists loosely together under Patience's neck so that he would not slide off in the long walk home, and that I wrapped my own cloak around his shoulders over his soaked greatcoat, and that I took the black stallion's reins in my left hand and Patience's in my right, and I started walking. The road home from Farringdon Corner is 3 miles. I had walked it perhaps 2,000 times in my life. I had never walked it slower, and I had never walked it more frightened. And the rain did not stop for a single one of those 3 miles. We came up the avenue of limes at a little before 6. The lamps were lit at the front of the manor. Mrs. Wren was a great believer in lamps, even when the oil was running short, on the grounds that a dark house was a defeated house. And I saw her come out onto the steps with her shawl over her head before I had even called out. She did not waste a moment on questions. She took one look at the man slumped over Patience, and she turned and shouted for old Hob the gardener, and within 5 minutes the 3 of us had the stranger off the mare and through the side door, and laid out on the long oak table in the gun-room, which was the room nearest to the door, and the room with the best light from the high windows. I could see, in that better light, what I had not been able to see in the rain. He had a thin white scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down into his beard. His hands were the hands of a man who had used them. There were calluses on the inside of his right thumb of a kind I had only ever seen on the village blacksmith, but the nails were trimmed close, and the skin between the knuckles was clean, and on the smallest finger of his right hand there was a heavy silver ring that bore, in deeply incised work, the figure of a wolf standing over an anvil. I had Mrs. Wren hold the lamp. I cut his greatcoat away with the kitchen shears. I cut the shirt under it. The wound was a small dark hole rather lower than I had feared, just above the hip on the right side, and there was a great deal of dried blood around it, and there was no exit wound that I could find. I did not touch it. I covered it with a folded clean cloth and pressed gently, and I sent old Hob out into the rain again to ride for Dr. Ashworth in the village. And I sat on a stool beside the table, and I held the man's left hand in both of mine, and I waited. Dr. Ashworth came at 7:30. He was a small gray man of 55 years who had been the village physician for as long as I could remember, and he had pulled 3 of my milk teeth and set my left wrist when I was 11 and broken it falling out of the pear tree. And he had been, in the long bad year of my father's illness, the only person in the parish who had not lied to me. He came in shaking the rain off his hat, and he looked at the man on the table, and he looked at me, and he said, "Yseult, who is this?" And I said, "I do not know," and he did not ask me anything else. He set his bag down, he rolled up his sleeves, he sent Mrs. Wren for hot water and clean linen and the sharp probe from the locked drawer in the surgery cabinet, which I had not realized she even knew existed, and he set to work. The ball was small, Dr. Ashworth held it up to the lamp afterwards on the flat of his palm, a little dark misshapen pellet no larger than a pea, and he turned it once and then dropped it into a saucer with a small, clear sound. "Pistol," he said, "not a hunting piece. He was shot at close quarters, in front of him, by a man standing roughly his own height. The angle is downward, which means the other man fired from the saddle, or from the top step of something. He has been bleeding for several hours, but not many. The ball missed the great vessels by less than the width of my thumb." He washed his hands in the basin. He looked at me over the towel. "It is a bad wound, Yseult, but not a mortal one, provided we can keep the fever off him. I will tell you plainly. The next 3 nights will decide it. After that, if he is still with us, he will live." I sat up the first night. I had Mrs. Wren make up a cot for him in the gun-room itself, since he could not be moved up the stairs without disturbing the dressing. And I had old Hob bring in the small iron stove from the gardener's cottage and set it in the corner with a good fire of beech wood. And I sat in the wing chair beside the cot from 9 in the evening until 5 in the morning, and I changed the cool cloth on his forehead every hour, and I gave him sips of water from a teaspoon every time he stirred, and he did stir, often, and he muttered, but he did not say anything I could understand. He spoke once in what I believed to be French, and once in what I believed to be Russian, and once he said very clearly the single word held, which I have since learned is the German for hero, and which at the time I took to be a name. He did not say his own name. He did not say any name at all. He slept 3 days in fever. On the 2nd day, Dr. Ashworth came again, and on the 3rd, and on each visit he changed the dressing, and he listened to the man's chest, and he nodded slightly to me at the door as he was leaving, which was the closest he ever came to giving me hope. On the 2nd night, Mrs. Wren took the watch, and on the 3rd night, Mrs. Wren and I took it together, because by then I had not slept enough to trust myself with the cloth and the spoon. He wore the silver ring through all of it. I had thought, at first, that I should take it from him for safekeeping, and then I had thought better of it, because there are some things one does not remove from an unconscious man, and a ring on his right pinky was one of them. I looked at it many times in the lamplight. The wolf was standing on its hind legs with one paw raised. The anvil was not the kind of anvil a smith would use. It was older, squarer, with 3 runes around the base that I could not read. I had seen, in a book in my father's library, a plate showing the arms of various of the older houses of the Eastern empires, and I had thought, dimly, that this ring was of that family of objects. But my father's library had been sold piece by piece over the previous year, and the book in question was not among the few I had kept, and so I could not look it up. I let it be. On the 4th morning he opened his eyes. I had just come in from the kitchen with a cup of weak tea for myself, having spent the small hours in the wing chair and having finally, around dawn, gone in search of something hot. And I came back through the gun-room door and I saw that his eyes were open and that he was looking, calmly, at the rafters. He turned his head when I came in. His eyes were a very pale gray, the color of a winter sky over wet slate. He looked at me. He looked at the cup in my hand. He looked at the dressing at his side, which he could see only by lifting his head a little. He looked back at me. "Madam," he said. His voice was low and quite even, with the faint roughness of a man who has not used it for some days. "I am at a loss. Will you tell me where I am?" I set the tea down. I sat in the wing chair, slowly so as not to startle him. "You are in the gun-room of Marchand House," I said, 3 miles north of Stow-on-the-Wold. "You have been here since Wednesday evening. Today is Sunday. I found you in a ditch at Farringdon Corner during a storm. You had been shot. The doctor removed the ball on Wednesday night. You have had a fever for 3 days. The fever broke at some point in the small hours of this morning. You are, I believe, going to live." He took this in. He did not show surprise or alarm, or any of the responses I might have expected from a man hearing that he had been 4 days unconscious in a stranger's house. He simply absorbed each fact, the way a man absorbs the news of a battle in a country he has visited but does not currently inhabit. When I had finished, he was silent for perhaps half a minute. Then he said, "Have you sent word to any one of my presence here?" "I have not," I said. I did not know to whom to send it. "Thank you," he said. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, he said, "My name is Adrien. I am, as you have surmised from the cloth, a man of some means. I was traveling north on private business. I was attacked. The matter is delicate. May I impose on you for a few days more, while I judge whether I can travel?" "You may stay until you are well," I said. I had not meant to say it quite so quickly, but I had said it, and I did not take it back. "Thank you, madam," he said. He looked at me for a long moment with those pale gray eyes. "I have not asked your name." "Yseult Marchand Vasseur," I said. "Lady Yseult," he said, for he had read my name, I suppose, the way a man of his apparent class reads names. "I am in your debt. I shall endeavor not to be a heavy guest." He was not a heavy guest. He was, in fact, the lightest guest the house had had in a decade. On the 5th day, Dr. Ashworth pronounced him fit to be moved upstairs, and we put him in the small blue bedroom that had been my mother's sewing room before her death, and which had not been used for any guest since, and he settled into it with such quietness that one would scarcely have known he was there. He took his meals on a tray for the first 3 days, and then at the table with us. He asked, on the second evening of his being able to walk, if he might be presented to the master of the house. I had, I confess, been dreading this. My father had not received a guest in a year. He could not stand. He could not speak. He could move the fingers of his left hand in answer to questions, by squeezing once for yes and twice for no, and that was all. I had thought of 100 ways to deflect Adrien's request, and in the end I had used none of them, because there was something in the way he had asked that did not permit deflection. I had taken him into my father's library, where my father sat by the fire in his great chair with the rug over his knees, and I had said, "Father, this is Mr. Adrien, who has been our guest these past 5 days. Mr. Adrien, my father, Lord Bramwell Marchand." Adrien had crossed the rug. He had not bowed in the modern way, with the head only. He had bowed from the waist, in the older way, the way men used to bow at the courts of the previous century, and he had said, "My lord, I am honored." Then he had sat down in the chair on the opposite side of the fire, and he had said, quite naturally, "Lady Yseult tells me you are a chess player. I am a poor one, but I should be glad of a game if you would teach me what I am missing." And my father, who had not played chess in a year and 1 month, who could not move a single piece, had looked across the rug at this stranger, and he had squeezed my hand once, very firmly, for yes. We played that evening, and the next, and the next. The system we worked out was simple. I sat between them with the board on a low table, and Adrien made his moves himself. And my father indicated his moves to me by a system of squeezes, 1 for the file, 2 for the rank, with letters for the columns and numbers for the rows. And I moved the piece for him. Adrien played with a slow, careful, considered style that was not the style of a man who was indulging an invalid. He played to win against an opponent who could not lift a pawn, and he lost on the 4th evening to a knight's fork that my father had set up over the previous 3 games, and when he laid down his king, he said, "My lord, that was beautifully done. I have not been beaten so cleanly in some years." My father's left eyelid drooped, very slightly, in what I had learned to read as a smile. He helped Mrs. Wren with the kindling on the 7th morning. I had come in from the dairy and I had heard the steady, measured sound of an axe in the woodshed, and I had gone to investigate, because old Hob had been laid up that day with his back, and I had assumed that Mrs. Wren was attempting the work herself, which she was too old by 10 years to be doing. I had found Adrien in shirt sleeves, with the bandage at his side just visible under the linen, splitting beech logs into kindling at exactly the rate old Hob would have done it, and Mrs. Wren standing by with an apron full of the split sticks looking, for the first time in a year, like a woman who was being looked after, rather than a woman who was looking after everyone else. He had nodded at me as I came in. "Lady Yseult," he had said, "Mrs. Wren was good enough to allow me to be useful." And he had gone on splitting the wood. I had not protested. I had, in fact, been unable to speak, because I had realized, watching him, that I had begun against my better judgment to like him very much indeed. I had known him, by then, for 10 days. He was, by every external measure, a complete stranger. I did not know his surname. I did not know where he had come from, or where he had been going, or who had shot him, or why. I knew that he was 33 years old, because he had mentioned it once in passing, and I knew that he had been a soldier, because of the way he carried himself, and the way he sat a horse, and the small unconscious gestures by which he checked the position of a weapon that was not there, and I knew that he was educated, because he could quote both Virgil and the German poets in their original tongues, and I knew that he was kind, because of the way he had bowed to my father, and I knew that he did not laugh easily, but that when he did it was a quiet, honest laugh that came up from somewhere deep in him, and did not pretend to be any more than it was. I knew, in short, the things that one learns about a man by living in the same house with him for 10 days and watching him without the protection of any prior knowledge of his name. I knew also by the 11th morning that I had begun to listen for his step on the stair. This is a thing one notices, I have found, when one has lived a long time in a house in which there are no men who walk. My father had not walked in a year. Old Hob came in only by the kitchen door, and only at mealtimes. I had grown so used to a house in which the only feet on the upper landing were my own and Mrs. Wren's, that the sound of a man's tread, slow and even and slightly favoring the right side because of the wound, had become a thing I waited for in the morning, the way other people wait for the sound of a clock striking. I was not, I told myself, in love with him. I did not believe in falling in love with strangers in ditches, but I had begun to listen for his step, and I had begun to set his place at the table without thinking about it, and I had begun, I noticed with some alarm, to choose my dresses in the morning with reference to which of them was the least mended. Captain Roderick's stall rode up the lane at 9 on the 11th morning. I was in the front parlor with the household accounts spread on the desk, because the 11th of the month was the day on which I went over the books, before paying the village creditors what I could of what I owed them, and I happened to look up and out of the window at the precise moment that a tall man on a tall bay horse came around the bend at the bottom of the avenue. He was riding fast, but not carelessly. He wore a long, dark green coat without facings or insignia, and a black hat pulled low against the cold, and his horse was sweating in a way that suggested he had ridden a long way that morning. He drew up at the gate. He sat for a moment, looking at the front of the house. Then he saw, through the window of the morning room, the window beside the parlor, where Adrien was at that moment sitting by the fire with my father, the chessboard between them. He saw the back of Adrien's head. His face changed. I saw it from where I sat. It did not blanch in the ordinary way of a man receiving a shock. It went still, the way water goes still in a basin when one has stopped stirring it. And then it went pale around the eyes and the mouth, and then he swung down from his horse so quickly that he half tripped on the stirrup, and he came across the gravel and through the gate and down onto one knee in the wet gravel of the path before he had even reached the steps. He took off his hat. He bowed his head. I could not hear through the glass what he said, but I read the shape of the words on his lips as clearly as if he had spoken them in my ear. Your Grace. I sat very still in my chair. I did not move for what felt like a long time but was probably only a few seconds. Mrs. Wren came to the parlor door. My lady, she said, there is a gentleman at the gate, on his knees, asking to speak to Mr. Adrien. Her voice was carefully neutral, in the way that the voices of housekeepers become carefully neutral when they have witnessed something they do not yet know the shape of. I said, Show him in, Mrs. Wren, to the morning room. I will join them. She nodded. She went. I stood up. I smoothed my skirt. I looked down at the household accounts, at the column of small tradesmen's bills that I had been about to attempt to settle, and I understood, with a clarity that came as much from the body as the mind, that the morning that had begun with those bills was not the morning that was going to end with them. I went out into the hall. I walked to the morning room. I opened the door. Adrien was standing by the fire. He had risen when the captain came in. The captain was inside the room, standing 2 paces from the door with his hat in both hands, and he was as upright as a man can be while still bearing himself with the particular bent-shouldered humility of a soldier in the presence of a superior officer to whom he believes he has failed. My father was in his chair by the chess table, watching the two of them with the bright, alert, slightly startled expression that he wore in the moments when he was most fully inside his own mind. The chess pieces were arranged in the middle of a game. A white knight had just been moved. Adrien turned as I came in. Lady Yseult, he said. His voice was the same voice it had always been, quiet, level, courteous. May I present Captain Roderick Stahl of my personal staff? Stahl, this is Lady Yseult Marchand, who saved my life on the 28th of October and to whom I owe more than I shall ever repay. The captain bowed. He bowed the way Adrien had bowed to my father, from the waist, in the older way. My lady, he said, I am honored beyond expression. Then he turned back to Adrien and he said, Your Grace, I have ridden from Dover. The Emperor sends his compliments and his urgent prayers for your recovery. There are matters which require... He glanced at me, briefly, and then back. Forgive me. I have come to take you home. Adrien did not look at me when he answered. He kept his eyes on the captain. Stahl, he said, I am not yet ready to travel. You will rest here today, and tomorrow you will ride back to London with a letter from me to His Imperial Majesty. The matters can wait the fortnight in which I shall be fit to ride. They have waited longer for less. Your Grace, said the captain. That is all, Stahl. Mrs. Wren will show you to a room. The captain bowed again. He went out. The door closed behind him. I had not yet moved from the doorway. Adrien looked at me at last. His face was the face I had known for 10 days. The calm gray eyes, the thin white scar, the slight lines at the corners of the mouth that I had learned were the lines of a man who had laughed more than he had let himself laugh. And yet it was also now a different face. It was the face of a man whom captains of dragoons knelt to in the gravel. Lady Yseult, he said, I owe you an explanation. I think, I said, you owe me a name. He inclined his head. My full name, he said, is Adrien Volkoff Esterhazy. I am the 9th Duke of Lankhammer. I am, by office, not by inclination, the Emperor's personal champion, which is to say, the man who fights, in single combat. The duels His Imperial Majesty cannot fight himself. 3 weeks ago I fought such a duel on the cliffs above Calais, against a man who had insulted the Empress in print. He was the better shot of the two of us that morning. He died, regrettably, before he could be brought to trial. I rode for England under another name because I was not, immediately afterward, in a state to be seen, and because there were certain parties on the French coast who would have been glad to finish what he had begun. I was on my way to a private estate in Yorkshire when I was overtaken on the road by a man who had been paid by those parties. He did not, as you have seen, succeed. The rest of the story you know. I stood in the doorway. The fire popped behind him. My father, in his chair, was watching us both with that bright, alert expression. I did not, for a long moment, know what to say. I had heard the name of the Duke of Lankhammer all my life. It was the name parents in the Cotswolds whispered to make children behave. There was a song the village boys sang. I had heard it in the lane outside the smithy when I was 12. About the Wolf of Lankhammer, who could cut a candle in two at 30 paces with a sabre, and who had killed, by the count of the song, 17 men in single combat for the honor of the imperial house. I had assumed, as one assumes about figures in songs, that he was either dead or invented. I had been feeding him broth from a teaspoon for 3 nights. You did not tell me, I said. I did not, he said. Why not? He considered the question. He did not, I noticed, look as if he had ever been asked it before. Because, he said at last, in the ditch at Farringdon Corner, you did not ask. And in the gun room when I woke, you did not ask. And in the library, when you presented me to your father, you did not ask. I had been treated, for 10 days, as a man. I had not been treated as a man in that fashion by anyone but my mother and my old fencing master in a great many years. I did not. I confess it. I did not wish it to end. I looked at him for a long time. Your Grace, I said finally, would you prefer to leave? He did not answer at once. Then he said, I would prefer to be told, by the lady of this house, what she would prefer. Stay until you are well, I said quietly. That was what I said on the 4th morning. I do not see that anything has changed. A great deal has changed, he said. Not the wound, I said. Stay until you are well. He bowed, not as he had bowed to my father, not as the captain had bowed to me. He bowed in a third way, which I had not seen before, and which I have since understood to be the bow that a man of his rank gives only when he intends a thing very seriously. He said, Lady Yseult, I shall. He stayed another 2 weeks. The house in those 2 weeks was not the house it had been before. Word travels, in the Cotswolds, faster than weather. By the 2nd day the village knew that the Duke of Lankhammer was at Marchand House. By the 3rd the post brought letters from neighbours who had not written to me in a year. By the 4th, a small carriage came up the lane bearing the wife of the member for Stowe, who had not previously crossed the threshold and who professed herself, over tea, to have always been a particular friend of my mother's. I made the tea myself. I served the cake. I sat through the call. Adrien did not come down. He was, Mrs. Wren said at the door, indisposed. He was not indisposed. He was in the morning room playing chess with my father. I did not enlighten the wife of the member for Stowe, and she did not see him, and she went away after 50 minutes with the air of a woman who had not got what she had come for. And when the carriage was gone, Adrien came down and we ate cold beef in the kitchen with Mrs. Wren at the same table, because the dining room was being aired, and he said nothing about the visit, and I said nothing about it, and that was the way he chose to live in our house. Lord Barton Chatwick came on the 8th day after the captain's arrival. I had been expecting him for some weeks. He was the Viscount whose lands ran along the southern boundary of ours, and he had been making, through his agent, and through letters and through 1 or 2 unfortunate visits in person, an increasingly insistent series of approaches with a view to purchasing the home farm and the orchard and, if I would consent to it, the manor itself. He was a heavy man of 50 with the wet pink complexion of a man who drank port for breakfast, and he had a habit of standing too close, and he had a habit of speaking to me as if he were addressing a child of 12 who needed to be talked out of climbing a tree. I had refused him 3 times. I had refused him by letter, and I had refused him in the parlor, and I had refused him at the gate of the home farm where he had ambushed me one morning in September, as I was going out to count the lambs. He had taken each refusal as a kind of opening offer. He had come on the 8th day after the captain, because the 8th day was the rent day in our parish, and he had calculated, correctly, that the rent day would find me at my most desperate. I was in the morning room when Mrs. Wren announced him. Adrien was in the morning room also, at the writing desk by the window, drafting the letter to the emperor that the captain had been carrying back and forth for him these 8 days. He looked up as Mrs. Wren spoke the name. He did not recognize it. I did. I said quietly, "Show him in, Mrs. Wren. I shall receive him here." Adrien rose as if to leave, and I said also quietly, "Stay, if you would, Your Grace. He need not be told who you are. I should be glad of a witness." Adrien bowed slightly. He sat down again at the writing desk. He turned, in fact, to face the window, with his back to the room and his profile in shadow, in such a way that a man entering the room would have taken him for a clerk, or a steward, or a visiting cousin without rank, which was, I afterward realized, a thing he had thought about and arranged in the half-second between my asking and his sitting. Lord Chatwick came in. He saw me. He did not, in any meaningful sense, see Adrien. He had the kind of vision that took in only the people he considered to be above him, and he had decided, of the 2 figures in the room, that I was one and the man at the desk was not. He bore down on me with his hand outstretched. "Lady Yseult," he said, "my dear lady, I have come, as I promised, on the rent day, to discuss our little arrangement." He sat down without being invited. He took up the cup of tea I had been drinking, and he set it down on the wrong saucer. "I have made up the figure. I have made it up generously, in view of our long association, and in view of your father's regrettable condition, and in view of the, frankly, rather pressing nature of your situation as regards the village creditors. I am prepared to offer £4,000 for the home farm, the orchard, the manor, and the 18 acres of grazing on the south slope. £4,000, my dear lady, today, in a banker's draft, to be drawn on Coutts. The figure was less than a fifth of what the property was worth. He knew it. I knew it. He had counted on the fact that the village creditors, between them, were owed something a little under £400, and that I had not yet found a way to pay them. He smiled at me with his wet pink mouth, and he waited for me to begin to thank him. I did not thank him. I said, "Lord Chatwick, the figure is not adequate. I have refused you 3 times. I refuse you a 4th. He laughed. It was not a pleasant laugh. "Lady Yseult," he said, "you cannot afford pride. Your father is dying. Your roof leaks. Your rent collection this quarter will not cover your apothecary's bill, let alone your servant's wages. I am offering you a clean exit. A house in Cheltenham, perhaps. A small annuity. The dignity of having sold rather than been sold up. If you refuse me again, I shall not come back. I shall buy the debt from the village creditors directly, and I shall foreclose, and I shall have the property for half what I am offering you today, and your father will die in a rented room, and you will end as a governess in someone's house in Bristol. Do you understand me?" I understood him. I had understood him from the first letter. I opened my mouth to speak, and at that moment Adrien, at the writing desk, set down his pen. He set it down with a small, clear sound. He turned in his chair. He stood up. He came across the room. He did not hurry. He came around the back of the sofa on which Lord Chatwick was sitting, and he stopped just behind it, where the light from the window fell across his face, and he looked down at the back of Lord Chatwick's neck, and he said, very politely, "Forgive me, my lord. I could not help overhearing." Lord Chatwick turned. He looked up. The wet pink color drained out of his face in a single, slow, even wash, the way a stain goes out of a tablecloth that has been put into hot water. He did not stand. He did not speak. He sat where he was, with his hand still on my teacup, and he stared up at Adrien as if Adrien were a thing he had once seen in a print and had taken, until that moment, to be a print only. "Your Grace," he said. The word came out as a kind of croak. "Lord Chatwick," said Adrien. "I had not realized that we were acquainted. We have, at the Earl of—" Lord Chatwick stopped. He licked his lips. He started again. "Your Grace, I had no idea that you were— that I was a guest in this house," said Adrien mildly. "Why should you have? I am a private guest of Lady Yseult and her father on a private matter, and I have not advertised my presence. But since I find myself in the room during a conversation regarding the future of the lady's estate, I should be glad to offer my opinion of the offer you have just made. Do you wish to hear it?" "Your Grace, I think you do not," said Adrien. "I think, in fact, that you wish to withdraw the offer and to apologize to Lady Yseult for the form in which it was made, and to take your leave. I think also that you wish, on returning to your own house, to write to the holders of the village debt, and to forgive each of them the portion you have lately purchased of those debts, as a gesture of neighborly goodwill. I think, in short, that you wish to remember that the Marchand family is under the personal protection of the Duke of Lankhammer, for so long as it shall please the Duke to extend it, which will be, I believe, for the remainder of his natural life. Do I summarize your wishes correctly, my lord?" Lord Chatwick stood up. He stood up so fast that he knocked over the teacup. The tea ran across the table and onto the rug. He did not notice it. He bowed in 3 short jerks of the head. He said, "Your Grace, my lady, I have been. I beg you will accept I shall write today." And he backed out of the room. He did not turn his back on Adrien until he was through the door, and he forgot his hat in the hall, and Mrs. Wren had to send old Hob after him with it down the avenue, and his carriage was out of the gate within 10 minutes of his coming in. He never returned to the house. The debts were forgiven by letter the following week, in language so abjectly humble that Mrs. Wren read the letter aloud at the kitchen table 3 times for the entertainment of all of us. And there were certain phrases: "Abase myself, presume too much upon your patience, in token of which I beg you will accept the enclosed," which became, for some weeks afterward, a private joke between Adrien and me, used to describe the more extravagant passages in the letters of every neighbor who wrote to the house thereafter. That should have been the end of the unpleasantness. It was not. There is a kind of unpleasantness that does not announce itself with a wet pink face at the morning-room door, but that creeps in by the back stairs in the form of a thin envelope addressed in a hand one knows. Lady Persephone Marchand was my father's first cousin's daughter, a spinster of 38, who had lived for the previous 14 years in a small set of rooms above the chemist's shop in Stowe, on the income of a legacy that had not kept pace with the cost of being a single woman of breeding. She had visited the house perhaps twice a year throughout my childhood, always at Christmas and always at Easter, and she had on each occasion contrived to be wounded by something I had said or done or worn or failed to do, and she had carried each wound away with her into the small set of rooms above the chemist's, where she had, I now believe, kept it in a private collection. She had not visited at all in the year of my father's illness. She had, I had assumed, given me up. She had not. The captain, on his 4th ride back from London, brought a letter for Adrien which was not from the Emperor. It was a copy of a letter, made by a clerk in the office of the Imperial Chamberlain, of a letter that had been sent anonymously to that office some 10 days previously. The original, the captain explained, had been opened by a junior secretary and read in full and forwarded up the chain to the Chamberlain himself, on the grounds that any letter making allegations against the conduct of the emperor's personal champion was a letter that had to be taken seriously even if it appeared, on its face, to be the work of a malicious hand. The captain had brought the copy at the chamberlain's express instruction. He had brought it, the chamberlain had said, with the chamberlain's compliments, and the chamberlain's regret that such a thing should ever have crossed his desk, and the chamberlain's invitation to the Duke of Lankhammer to handle the matter as he saw fit. Adrien read the letter at the writing desk in the morning room. I was at the other end of the room with the household ledger. He read it once, slowly, and then he read it a second time, and then he set it down and he said, "Lady Yseult, I should be grateful for your opinion on a small matter. May I trouble you?" I came across. He gave me the letter. I read it. The hand was Lady Persephone's. I had known it from the first line. The letter alleged, in language that pretended to be reluctant and was not, that the Lady Yseult Marchand Vasseur was a calculating young woman of fallen fortune who had taken advantage of an injured nobleman to install him in her household with a view to compromising his honor and securing, by such compromise, a marriage that would not otherwise have been within her reach. It alleged that the household was improperly chaperoned. It alleged that I had been seen, by persons of unimpeachable character, to enter the bedroom of the said nobleman alone and after dark. It alleged that the entire matter was an embarrassment to the imperial house, and could only be remedied by the immediate removal of the said nobleman from the said household, and by some appropriate notice being given to the said young woman of the disapproval in which she was held by all right-thinking persons. It was signed, "A friend of the family." I set the letter down. My hands, I noticed, were not quite steady. I said, "Your Grace, I am sorry that you have had to read this." "You know the hand," he said. It was not a question. "I know the hand. Tell me her name." I told him. I did not embroider. I told him she was my father's first cousin's daughter, and that she lived above the chemist's in Stowe, and that she had been, all my life, a woman with a great deal of resentment and very little to do with it. He listened. He did not write the name down. He nodded once, when I had finished. Then he said, "Lady Yseult, I shall handle this. I shall not punish her. I should like, if you will permit it, to handle it in such a way that it does not return." "You may handle it as you see fit," I said. He went into Stowe that afternoon with the captain. He came back at 6. He did not tell me what had passed in the small set of rooms above the chemist's. I learned the substance of it 3 days later, when Lady Persephone wrote me a letter, the only letter she ever wrote me that did not contain a wound, informing me that she had decided, on reflection, to remove herself from the close society of the Cotswolds, which had never suited her constitution, and that she had been fortunate enough to secure a small dignified house in Bath, on the Royal Crescent, on terms which she described as most generous, and that she would be leaving on the Tuesday following. The terms, I later learned, were that the house had been bought outright, and the rates and the upkeep paid for in perpetuity, by a private benefactor whose name she was not at liberty to mention. The condition was that she should not return to Cotswold society and should not write again, on any pretext, to any office of the imperial household. She accepted. She went. I did not see her again. She lived another 23 years, I am told, in great respectability, on the Royal Crescent. She wrote me one more letter, at the news of my father's death, 8 years afterward, and it was a kind letter, and I have it still. The morning Adrien proposed was the morning of the 3rd of December. He had been in the house by then, 5 weeks and 3 days. He was, by Dr. Ashworth's pronouncement, fit to ride. The captain had been twice more to London and back, and the Emperor's letters had grown, with each exchange, more formal and more impatient, and I had understood, although neither Adrien nor the captain had said so, that the next ride to London would be the one from which Adrien did not return to us. I had understood it for a week. I had been, in consequence, very quiet at meals, and very brisk in the dairy, and very thorough in the household accounts, in the way one is thorough about small things when one is not yet permitted, by oneself, to think about a large one. He came to find me in the gun-room. I was there because I had been laying out, on the long oak table on which we had laid him 5 weeks before, the linen for the winter. The gun-room was the warmest room on the ground floor in the morning, and Mrs. Wren and I had taken to using it for the airing of sheets. I was folding a pillowcase when he came in. He stood in the doorway. He did not come into the room. He stood at the threshold, where my own foot had been when Mrs. Wren and old Hob and I had brought him through, and he looked across the table at me, and he said, "Lady Yseult, I find I cannot leave this house without putting a question to you, and I find I cannot put it to you anywhere but here." I set the pillowcase down. I did not say anything. "I owe you my life," he said. "That is a debt I cannot pay. I do not propose to try to pay it. I propose, instead, to ask you a different question, which is whether you would permit me to spend the remainder of the life you saved in asking your opinion of how it should be lived. I am 33 years old. I am in a profession I did not choose. I am, by every public measure, a man whom one does not refuse, and I am asking you, in private, in a room you know better than I know it, to refuse me if you wish, with the assurance that no part of the protection I have extended to this house will be withdrawn by reason of your refusal. I shall be your friend either way, but I am asking, Lady Yseult, will you marry me? I stood at the table. The pillowcase was at my hand. The light from the high window fell across the boards we had laid him on. I did not, for what felt like a very long time, speak. I was thinking, partly, of the question. I was thinking, partly, of the war that was coming. For there was a war coming, between the Empire and the French, which everyone in England had known about for some months, and which the Emperor's personal champion was certain to be in the center of. I was thinking, partly, of my father in his chair by the fire, and of who would move his chess pieces if I were not there to read his hand. I was thinking, mostly, of the man at the threshold, and of the 10 days in which I had not known his name, and of the ring on his right pinky which I had decided, on the second night, not to take off him. Adrien, I said, for I had not, until that moment, called him by his name without his title, and the doing of it surprised me as much as it surprised him. The war is coming. You will be in it. You will be in it for some time. I shall not have a husband killed in his first year. I shall not have a husband killed in his second. Come back when the war is done. If you still ask, I shall still answer. He did not, I saw, take this as a refusal. He took it as the answer it was. He bowed, not the bow he had given my father, and not the bow he had given the captain, but the third bow, the one he had given me at the morning-room door on the day the captain came. And he said, "Lady Yseult, I shall." Then he came into the gun-room, and he took my hand, and he raised it to his lips, and he held it there for a moment, and he set it down. Then he went out, and he packed. And at noon he rode south with the captain, and the avenue of limes at 12:30 was empty in a way it had not been empty since the rain at Farringdon Corner. The war lasted 3 years. It was longer and harder than any of us in the village had expected, and it was fought in places I had to find on a map and learn the names of. And at one point in the second year, it came within 70 miles of the southern coast of England. And there was a fortnight in March of 1819 in which everyone in the Cotswolds was packing carts and burying silver in their gardens against the possibility of invasion. The invasion did not come. The war went the other way, in the end, after the great battle at Saint-Méloire in the spring of 1820, in which the Emperor's personal champion led the cavalry of the right wing through a gap in the French line and decided, by all accounts, the day. He was wounded again at Saint-Méloire. He was not, this time, found in a ditch by a passing stranger. He was carried off the field by his own men. He wrote me every month. The letters came by the regular post, addressed in his own hand to Lady Yseult Marchand Vasseur, Marchand House, near Stow-on-the-Wold, Gloucestershire. And they were not love letters in the sense the village would have understood the word. They were letters about chess. They were letters about books. They were letters about the country he was passing through, and the small things he had noticed in it, and the things he wished he had asked my father about, and the things he wished he had asked Mrs. Wren about, and the things he had remembered, and the things he had not. They were the letters of a man who was talking, slowly and at long range, to the woman whose opinion of how his life should be lived he intended, in the end, to ask. I kept them all. I have them still. They are in a small cedar box in the upper drawer of the writing desk in the morning room, and there are 36 of them, and they are, between them, the longest conversation I had with anyone in those 3 years. My father lived through the first year of the war. He did not live through the second. He died in his chair by the fire in the November of 1819, with my hand in his and Mrs. Wren at the door, and his last squeeze on my hand was a single firm squeeze, which in our private language was the word yes, and I have always taken it that he was answering, on his own terms and in his own time, the question that Adrien had put to me at the gun-room threshold, and that he had not been able, while he was living, to be told about. We buried him in the village churchyard beside my mother. The Duke of Lankhammer sent flowers from the field at Mannheim. They arrived 4 days after the funeral, having been carried by a series of riders across half of Europe, and they were laid on the grave none the less, and they kept their color, by some miracle of cold weather and good packing, for nearly a week. He came back in the May of 1820. The war had been over for 6 weeks. The captain rode up the lane first on the same bay horse and dismounted at the gate, and walked up to the house bareheaded and said to me at the door, "My lady, His Grace is at the inn at Stow. He sends his compliments and asks whether he might be received this afternoon at 3. I said, "Captain Stall, His Grace is not required to send word ahead in this house, and you know it." The captain smiled. He had not, in 3 years, smiled at me before. He said, "My lady, His Grace was of the opinion that on this particular afternoon the courtesy was warranted." He bowed. He went back down the lane. At 3 he came up it again, with Adrien at his side. Adrien was thinner than he had been. There was a new thread of gray at his right temple, and there was a new scar high on his left cheekbone, and he limped very slightly on the leg that had been wounded at Saint-Méloire. And he was, in every respect that mattered, the man who had stood at the gun-room threshold 3 years before. He came up the steps. He did not, this time, bow. He stood at the door, and he said, "Lady Yseult, I find I am still asking." "Then come in," I said. "I am still answering." We were married at the village chapel on the 2nd Saturday in June. Mrs. Wren gave me away, because there was no one else, and old Hob carried the rings, and Dr. Ashworth read the lesson, and Captain Stall stood as Adrien's witness. And there were perhaps 40 people in the chapel, all of them villagers I had known all my life, none of them grand. The Emperor sent a letter. He did not send himself, which was, Adrien said afterward, the greatest courtesy he had ever paid anyone. We went, after the wedding, not to Lankhammer Castle, which I had been told to expect to be terrified of, and which I have been since on many occasions, but not terrified of, but back to Marchand House, for a fortnight, because I had not been able to bring myself to leave the house empty for longer than that, and Adrien had understood, without my having to say it, that I needed to go home before I went anywhere else. I am older now than I was when I rode home from the apothecary in the rain. I have lived in many houses, and I have traveled in many countries, and I have been received at courts whose names I did not know how to pronounce when I was 24. I have 3 children. I have, between us, 4 grandchildren. My husband still wears the silver wolf and anvil ring on his right pinky. He has, in the years since the wedding, fought no more duels on behalf of any emperor, and he has, by his own account, been the better man for it. He plays chess, in the long evenings, with whoever is nearest at hand. He plays it slowly and considerately, and to win. I have thought, often in the quiet years, of the things we ask of strangers in the rain, and of the things we do not ask. I have thought of the silver ring on the small finger of an unconscious man, and of the runes around the base of the anvil that I could not read on the night I first saw them, and of the book in my father's library that had been sold the year before, and that would have told me what I was looking at. I have thought of the moment on the 4th morning in the gun room when he opened his eyes and gave me one name, and of the 11th morning when the captain came up the avenue and gave me another, and of the way the second name fitted, when it came, into the shape the first had already left in the air. I have thought of how easy it would have been on the road that afternoon to ride past the black stallion, who was not making any noise, and who was standing very still beside a ditch that one could not see into from horseback. I do not know exactly what would have happened if I had ridden past. I do not let myself dwell on it. I let myself dwell instead on what did happen, which was that I did not ride past, and that the ring on his finger was a ring I did not know how to read, and that the question he asked me at the gunroom threshold was a question I asked him, 3 years later, to ask me again. If you are listening to this story tonight, in whatever room, in whatever weather, I would ask you only one thing, and it is the thing I have learned slowly over a long life from a man I did not know the name of for the first 10 days of our acquaintance. The strangers we find in the rain are, very often, more than they appear. The rings we do not recognize are, very often, the rings we will come in time to know. And the questions we are not yet ready to answer are, very often, the questions that wait, patiently and without complaint, to be asked of us a second time by the same voice, in the same room, on a quieter afternoon, when we have grown into the answer that was always going to be ours. Stay, if this story has spoken to you, for the rest of the evening's stories. There will be more of them, in this same voice, on quieter afternoons, when the rain has stopped and the fire is good, and the chess pieces are set out on the small table between 2 chairs that have been waiting, all this while for the right 2 people to sit down in them. I am glad you came. I am glad you stayed. I shall see you again, in another house, in another rain, when the next stranger is found at the edge of the next ditch, and the next question waits, as the question always waits, to be asked.